This is the Get a Life podcast. Ex-Cult Conversations.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Get a Life podcast. Today is cold. It's January. Cold up north, but nice and warm down here. Can't help but rub that in. Today we have a special guest with us. He actually grew up and made a lot of visits to my hometown in Nitchie. Your grandparents were Pemina, though, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And we saw him often. His grandparents were from Pemina. Welcome to the show today, Bradley McCallum.
Thank you. It's nice to see you all.
It's nice to have you. So, Brad, I don't know where you want to start with this one. Do you want to just start with a little bit of where you're from?
Sure, we can do that. I was born in 1970, the end of 1970, November, and grew up in Detroit, and grew up in the meeting in Detroit, where my parents were local. My grandparents, my mother's parents, were local in St. Vincent. They lived in Pemina, which is near Nitchie. So I spent a lot of time in the summers out there during my preteen and early teen years. My father's parents had been withdrawn from earlier in 1970 before I was born, so I never actually met them. Had two sisters. My dad had stayed in 1970 with one of his brothers. His parents and his sister had left, and sister and her husband and family had left in 70. So it was a family kind of divided, which was, having been born in 70, was a very raw wound and kind of a constant presence with us growing up in the house. During the growing up, I interacted, particularly in my early teens and mid-teens, with JHS a number of times, who I will say always to me and my parents and my grandparents was very kind. As I grew older and was listening to some of the things in his meetings, I was kind of flabbergasted because of the difference in what felt like crazy talk versus what felt like, on a personal level and our family level, very different.
So just to make it clear for our listeners, JHS is James Symington, who was the leader of the Brethren in that period.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Then in the late 80s, I don't remember what year it was exactly, JHS died, and Mr. John Hales became the leader. My father was kind of ecstatic over this. He was a huge John Hales supporter and just was kind of over the moon. And at least I feel like my experience, having listened to a lot of other people's experiences, my experience growing up was quite different. But in any event, my experience of John Hales taking over was one of kind of almost like a kind of a renewal period. Mr. Symington had been sick for a long time and sort of semi out of commission, and the place had been kind of run in an interregnum with various people. But then when Mr. Hales took over, there was this big push, at least in my experience, and particularly in Detroit in the meeting, with this kind of renewed focus on serious engagement with what they called the truth, reading the ministries, the old ministries, studying the Bible seriously, a huge crackdown on drinking, at least in our area. And Mr. Hales, he spoke publicly about it. I heard him, and not only in the meetings, but in the house. And it just led to kind of this period of relative stability, but kind of almost puritanical sobriety and kind of monastic, this big focus on just kind of really buckling down. I was I was 18 and I was interested in a young sister, and so I wanted to write her a letter and just try and get to know her, because I had never spoken to her actually. And I was advised by the local priests to call Mr. Hales and discuss this with him, which I did. And it was probably a 2-3 minute call. Mr. Hales asked, who I was, and my dad was on the line, and who she was. And she was a cousin of the guy who was in charge in Detroit. So, and he had met her because he had either been at or taken 3D meetings in Detroit not long before this, and she had been a babysitter in the house. And so he knew her. And so he said, well, what you should do is wait until she is 18. She was 17. Wait until she is 18 and get married straight away. And I kind of gulped, because I had actually never spoken to her. So I said, okay. And we got off the phone, and my dad said, well, you know what to do now. So I called her at her father's house and said, I've spoken to Mr. Hales and said I was interested in marrying you. And he said we should get married. And she said, okay.
Wow. Wow.
Wow.
So
Wow.
between then and this was maybe 3 months before I think this was in the summer, and I turned 19 in November and she turned 18 in December. And we got married 4 days after she turned 18. We had maybe spoken half an hour, 30 minutes.
I just can't believe that this man, thinks that he has the authority to bless or not bless people's marriages. That blows me away.
Yeah, I can 100% confirm what you're saying. I had exactly the same experience of phoning John Hales and then marrying someone that I'd, getting engaged, committed to marry someone that I'd spoken to for literally 5 minutes. So you got a 25 minutes advance on me there. But yeah, that is what happened. Incredible as it sounds, that is really what happened in those days.
Yeah, it does sound unbelievable in retrospect. Like thinking back on it, it does seem unbelievable, but it very much happened.
It was normal in that environment.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got married. We promptly started having children. And we had 5 children in 6 years.
Yeah.
And that was a really difficult period of our lives, as one can imagine. Physically, Brent, my ex-wife, wasn't well. She also had other health challenges that I just am a little reluctant to say too much, but
Yeah, of course.
challenges that made life, our family life, pretty unstable. She eventually became under the care of one of the Brethren doctors, who was actually quite a kindly guy, and got her medication. But it was an extraordinarily challenging period of our lives. But there were weird things, just by this point, I had started to sort of doubt things in my mid to late teens, but decided I'd really go all in. I'd double down. I'd become the poster child of Brethranism. But then there was just so much weird nonsense, her mother was able to come and help for a few days after the birth of our first child, but was not allowed to come to the subsequent children, which is bizarre, because that's actually when you need the help.
Yeah,
I remember that rule. Yeah.
Why was the rule? Was it scripture based or something? Or
I don't
It was a
know.
hard and fast rule. Yeah.
what? You could
Crazy.
that the mother-in-law could only help with or the mother
First
could only
child.
help with the first child?
Yep.
I don't know whether the assumption was that she would teach everything that needed to be taught at that time, and that the couple would be on their own afterwards. I really don't know.
Yeah.
But
That doesn't
I
make
was
sense at
working a
all.
tremendous amount. I worked for my dad. During this period as well, our businesses, kind of ebbed and flowed. I mean, his business does, but they were never big business. But they did well, but they were starting to encounter some challenges, and I had some real differences with my dad on the way he was doing things, and he would not entertain even the slightest engagement on that because he was the man in charge, And anyway, by the time the kids were toddlers and sort of young youth, young children, I had pretty much, there was this period in Detroit where things were under this extremely hardline sort of rule by a gentleman. The only guy I really harbor still really, really deep dislike for. Everyone else has kind of faded into kind of a numb ache, but the guy that was in charge in the 80s was just a dreadful, I believe was a dreadful person, who just recently was restored, by the way. He's back in the
Oh, can you name him, or would you prefer not to?
It's Rick Wilson.
Yeah.
I've heard of him.
Yeah.
I've heard terrible stories about him.
He was my wife's first cousin. Just
Extremely religious hardliner.
Hard, like I don't even, when you read the definition of a psychopath about someone not having emotion, I genuinely feel that he came very close to that. He displayed virtually no emotion. But I will say this about him: he lived an almost monastic style. I mean, he kind of lived what he yelled and taught about, but he was a complete I probably shouldn't swear.
Oh no, you can say it.
Oh, you can swear as much as you want on here.
Asshole, complete. He was really, he effed around in our marriage. He meddled around, like turning my wife against my mother, Max against my mother, saying shit to me about my dad, saying shit to my parents about us. He was just an awful person, genuinely awful person. And we went through this period in the 80s where he was really, there was a weird faction of brethren in Detroit. There was these kind of three camps in our sort of meeting and interchange. There was the ultra religious in with the current regime thing. There was this whole group of people that were kind of semi stuck in the past and kind of living brethren in the 50s lives and kind of and then there was the ones that were just 1 foot out, and he kind of brought everything to a head with that group in the 80s, early 90s, and a whole slew of people left, people I really liked, people I really knew and cared about. And he also was forming kind of factions, kind of leading this forming of the in people and the people who are on the naughty list. Which was endemic in the brethren, as all of you know.
Oh yes.
And so I started to really completely lose confidence in the whole thing, and then just literally in the span of a few weeks, I just completely lost any sense that this thing was right. It just kind of washed over me like the dam broke. Once you start allowing doubt and thinking critically, and it's all nonsense. It is all nonsense.
Yeah, the harsh light of reality breaks in.
Yeah, and then you just realize it's all garbage. It's all garbage.
Yeah,
it's tyrannical.
Yeah,
it is illogical. It is not founded even remotely in Scripture. It is antithetical to Christianity. It, I believe, is a kind of a gross perversion of Jesus's teachings. So I started to become problematic for the brethren in Detroit. I started raising questions, but never overtly. I'm a non-confrontational person, so I was doing stuff which in their minds made it even worse because I was being deceitful. I'm like, not really. I was just talking to someone.
Yeah. it was bad enough to hurt them, but not bad enough they could withdraw from you. Yeah.
No, not that. No.
In the Plymouth Brethren, they love to throw around another word which we use differently in the normal world, wicked, right? They would always call something wicked, where the normal world, that's awesome, that's cool, wow, that was wicked. You see that, right? In the Plymouth Brethren, something wicked was deeply satanic.
Well, and in the 80s, Rick's kids were all little, and he had a lot of them. How many do you have? 8, 9, 10?
11, I think.
11.
Wow.
Okay. And his
They're
kids were all little. And I mean, it's when your kids are little, you can sort of keep them in line a whole lot easier. But when they get into their teen years, that's kind of when the challenge starts. And I remember sitting there thinking, boy, he is so religious and so hardline. Just wait till his kids get a little bit older. And he did end up against that wall.
Did any of his kids leave?
Yeah. So his oldest son, Lee, actually worked for my dad and I. And in fact, my last full day in the Brethren before I left was spent with Lee.
They were characters too. I mean,
they were funny.
I
will say this, that the kids were funny, they were smart, they had
very charismatic. Yeah.
But just Rick had a charisma as well. It was just not the funny charisma.
No, not funny at all. When he looked at you and you were doing something wrong, you knew you were doing something wrong. Like, he didn't have to say it. It was just something about his look.
But after I left, and there was a kind of a several year period where I went back, I came out, I went back, I came out, lots of visits and things. And, at one point Lee left as well, because Lee was, I don't know, 3 or 4, maybe 5 years younger than me. And, that was kind of held over me that, I had been this bad influence on him. The really tragic thing about Lee is he did leave properly at one point, and he ended up with 2 small children from someone he was in a relationship with, who then he ended the relationship and took the children and started a relationship with another woman. And in any event, he, around the time of the review, tried to go back, and his mother was from Australia, from Metro Sydney. I think she was from Kellyville. And he had some direct communication with Mr. Hales, and reportedly, and I don't know the details of it, but he got a letter from his grandfather in Australia detailing he had been trying to get back, and he had these 2 children, and he'd been involved with drugs and drink, and he was one of the people who had gone out and really, you've all known them, the people who go out and just can't really function properly. But he had these 2 children, and he had decided he wanted to go back, and he had been having these communications with the Brethren in Detroit, and he got, apparently, what I was told was he got this letter from his grandfather who had been in communication with the regime there in Sydney, and he killed himself that night or the next morning. So who knows what was
awful.
Who knows? It's one of these weird unclosed chapters for me, as someone I knew extremely well, someone I had literally spent my last day inside with, and he must have been put under some sort of extraordinary pressure to do that. I mean, not just knowing him, it must have been extraordinary. Adding tragedy to tragedy, because the person that he was in a relationship with was not the children's birth mother, and they were not married. The Brethren took the children from the only person that they had ever known as a mother, which was this poor woman trying to raise these children. So
they took,
well, legally Lee's parents were the next.
See, and that's why this is so important for people to, I know Shelley did a post the other day, it was a bit ago. It was such a good post about all the things that you should have in. And I mean, I have a will, 100%, I'll say it right now. Like, my nobody from the brethren are allowed to touch my body, or allowed to have anywhere near my funeral, or allowed to have anything to do with my children. It is stated in there, very detailed, of the absence of them. And I think it's important for people to make sure that that is covered. You should have a will.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have it, write it down somewhere and sign it.
Yeah. I did mine, and I made sure that as well. I was like, absolutely. Well, I put in mine no religion, and I was like, yeah, I do not want my family there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, go on.
So I started to get kind of these thoughts and doubts were building, challenges in our family business. My conflicts with my dad were becoming stronger. My issues with Rick and the hierarchy in Detroit were becoming more pronounced. And, and as a young parent, I just started to feel like I was going crazy, to be perfectly honest. I felt like I was going to snap. And I did one day. I just decided I needed 2 to 3 weeks away from everything to regroup. So I did that. I wrote a letter, and I'm not proud of it. I wrote a letter and left it for my wife and said I'll be back in 2 to 3 weeks. Left a message for my dad, and then this is where things get really weird. I actually bought a ticket. This was all pre 9/11. So I drove to the airport and thought, where should I go? And I had gotten a bunch of cash out and bought a ticket, a round trip ticket to London, an hour before the flight was supposed to leave. Walked to the gate, got on the plane and flew to London. Got to London. I found out, and then just literally walked around London for about 5 days.
Wow.
Was that the first vacation you'd ever gone on?
Yeah. But I was in a really foggy state of mind. I mean, I remember quite vividly, but I was beginning to get feeling kind of, I felt unwell, honestly.
Yeah.
Anxiety and
yeah. So I reached out to my dad and my ex-wife at one point from the Charing Cross post office, which was in central London. And they had already tracked me to London somehow. This tracking and following people, this shit's been going on for decades.
Yeah.
They already knew I was in London. They already had people stationed following me, and watching for me. So I, at that point, kind of panicked. And I spent an entire afternoon like trying to ditch them walking. And if you've ever been in central London, that's a relatively easy task to ditch untrained people.
Yeah.
So then I ended up actually sleeping in a park for 2 days because I was terrified of going back to my hotel. I slept in Hyde Park on a bench. And then thought, I'm just going to get up and I'm going to leave everything that I brought with me, except I bought a bike in London, which is weird. But I bought a bicycle. So I took my bike and I got a taxi to the airport, and I flew home, and I changed my destination to Boston. So I flew into Boston, and I'm going through immigration, and they said, can you come with us? Can you come? So I went into the back room, and they said, you've been reported as a missing person. And I said, I'm not a missing person. Everyone knows where I am. I've been in constant contact. And they said, well, under the laws, we just have to make contact with you, advise you that you've been reported as missing, but then we will also are required to report back to your family where you were made contact with. I thought, oh, that's clever. And they will know then I re-entered the country.
Yeah, that sounds like bullshit too, that they have to disclose where you are. Because if you say I am not missing, I am here of my own free will, then they should not have to tell them where you are. That's sketchy.
But that's not how it works.
So
No, and I mean exactly the same thing happened to me in almost identical circumstances. I reached a point where I just couldn't take the stress anymore of being in the brethren. There was a whole load of financial and business stuff thrown at me, and well, yeah, there's a whole backstory, but I just literally walked out. I left. I rented a little room, cheaply as I could, out in the countryside, 50, 60 miles from home. And, I was very, very distressed, and I needed space and time just to walk. And I just walked and walked and walked, probably did 100 miles in 3 to 4 days. And it ended exactly the same way. The police caught up with me, pulled me over and said, "You're on the missing persons list." And I hadn't even thought about it before, but the reason the brethren had done that, to put me on the missing persons list, was just it's a good way to find out where I was. It wasn't due to any concern about me. Yeah. So it's very, very interesting. They did the same thing to you.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Richard.
Yeah.
It's just, what year was that?
That would have been 2015.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what year were they doing this to you, Bradley?
It was in the late 90s. I think it was.
So they haven't changed at all then.
No, these practices of hiring private investigators. I mean, my dad talked about being involved in private investigator nonsense in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been doing this.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I ended up in Boston. I got rented a little room somewhere in a rooming house, and walked, trying to figure out my next step. And I'm walking through South Station in Boston, and South Station is the main train station in Boston. I mean, it's this huge cavernous place full of people and trains. And I mean, Boston's a big city. And all of a sudden I feel a hand on my arm, gripping it tightly. And I turned, and it was one of my cousins, my wife's cousin. And he said, "It's time to go home."
Holy shit. He was right there?
Yeah. So, I mean, how they found me in South Station, Boston, he maintained complete coincidence, God's will. I just happened to be standing here in South Station.
Yeah.
But even in my really distressed state of mind, I knew that was not.
Yeah.
They had somehow tracked me, and this was pre-smartphone. I don't know how they tracked me, but they had tracked me down. We went out to the car. He said, "We're going to wherever you have your things." I said, "I have very little." And he said, "Well, we'll go and get it, and I'm driving you to the airport." And I was emotionally and kind of psychologically pretty distressed at this point, so I just went with him. We got my stuff, drove me to the airport. They put me on a plane. I arrived in Detroit to the loving arms of Rick Wilson waiting at the gate, who said, "I'm glad you're home, but you're very, very sick.
You're sick?
You're very sick, and you need to come home, and you need to get treatment." So we went to the house, and Dr. Truan was there, Dr. Phil Truan. I don't know if any of you knew him, but yeah. He was a Brethren doctor, local in Detroit, and he gave me shots of who knows what it was. And then he would come and visit once a day. And
shots as in injections.
Injections, yeah.
Not shots in a shot glass.
And he didn't tell you what they were.
No, he just said it will help make me better. But
that's terrifying.
It sort of decommissioned me. I was in bed for weeks. Then I started to get this panicky feeling again, and I kind of redid this whole thing over again. One day I just left, but I didn't fly. I drove, because I thought, well, if I drive, they're not going to be able to find me. And I went back to Boston, back to the same place I was. In literally within 6 hours, I got out of my car, and there were multiple brethren there who walked over. Said,
"Did you have a mobile phone?"
I had a flip phone.
Yeah, it must have been. But what year was this?
98, 99.
I don't think they had any streamlined stuff then.
How would they be tracking them and stuff? I'm just
maybe they put stuff in my clothes. Maybe they had something in my wallet. I don't know.
Tracker in your car is quite plausible. I mean, they would probably have that technology then. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's.
I mean, they can attach it by magnet to your underside of your vehicle.
Let's not give them any ideas if they're not doing it.
Yeah. Oh,
No,
no,
they're
they're
already
doing it
doing it.
already.
I know they're
I
already
want them
doing
to
it.
follow me. I'm begging them to. No,
So
sorry.
then
Go on, Bradley.
They flew me home. I was put back in bed, was given more injections. And at some point, Dr. Chuan switched it to tablets, like I should just take these pills. And I at this point was starting to get some clarity in my head. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a lot more complicated than I thought. So I stopped taking the medicine and just disposing of it when no one was around in the bathroom. And I became very clear in my mind, I am actually not sick. I am not completely debilitated and having to lay in bed. So I thought, okay, this time when I leave, I'm going to do it differently. So I went and thinking back on it, Richard, I think you're probably right on the car, because I drove the car to a local train station and got on a train
Mm-mm.
to go to Chicago. And when I get to one of the towns in Michigan, halfway to Chicago, brothers got on the train and pulled me off the train.
Wow.
So they had figured out where the car was. Okay,
Yeah.
it's at the station, the last train left, whatever. And they'd somehow gotten ahead of the train. Anyway, got back home. This time they took everything away from me. They took my passport, my money, my identification, literally everything. They said, you need to surrender everything because you're deeply and profoundly unwell. You need to try and So I kind of let it go that point for a while. I had not been withdrawn from it, I'd just been shut up. We were restored, went back to meeting. But then I said, well, I'll have to do this a bit more methodically.
Holy cow.
I did. And
you are not defeated. I'll give you that.
One day I found hidden, I found my wallet with all my ID and my passport and everything in the house. So they had not removed it from the house. They had just thought they had secreted it away. So I thought, okay, well, that will make it easier for when I'm ready to go. So then I left a final time and just stayed in Detroit, stayed locally and got a job. Went into the hotel business because my dad had several companies, and one of them was a property management company. So I thought that's kind of similar, but it's kind of worldly and it's kind of fun sounding. So I'll go into the hotel business. So I did that, and that's what I've done ever since. But they came and would lay in wait outside my work and kind of block my entrance into the place and try and talk to me into coming home. And finally I said, it's just, you guys have got to stop. And if you don't stop, I'm going to get a protection order against you guys. You're harassing me now. So yeah, then I went through a really kind of dark period personally, drinking a lot, doing drugs, just living really terribly. Somehow managed to keep a very good employment component of my life going. But I got an apartment right down in the ghetto where I didn't think they would want to come and they would be too scared to come. And made some really good friends. Eventually moved to Chicago, met some really fantastic people there who really took me under their wing. So one guy was actually a young Church of Scotland minister who was interning in Chicago, who was very familiar with the brethren. So we became good friends. He's still one of my oldest friends. Went from Chicago. I ended up getting married again to a woman that didn't last very long. She was German, moved to Germany, learned fluent German, enrolled in university there. Was going to university and living and working there in Germany, and decided I didn't want to be there anymore, and my marriage ended, and I moved to England. Lived in London for a number of years. During that period, I spent some time with the company I was working with. Intercontinental sent me to Asia for a while, so I was in Hong Kong for a bit, and Bangkok and Thailand. And came back to London, then in what was it, late 2000 aughts, so probably 2007 or 8 at this point. I so there was the whole review in the middle of all this. So I would make annual trips back, and I said, I had a right to see my children. I had just signed over everything financially to my ex-wife and my kids, so I literally had took nothing from anybody. Just I said I did want to be able to see them,
Yeah.
and that was granted. So so I would make annual trips back, and I would visit the children, but it was always with a priest there. It's extremely stilted and awkward. And then so I'm working in London, and I get a call in my office in London, and it's two priests from Detroit. The old regime was out. Rick apparently was on the outs. There's new guys. One of them was a cousin of mine. They said, we've treated you wrongly. We've treated you as bad as we could have ever treated anyone. We want to tell you that we're sorry, that we'd like to make it right. I'm like, well, it's a little late now, a decade, half a decade, and you guys haven't even reached out, but whatever. It's silly. Well, just so you know, we're here for you. Feel free to chat anytime. Anytime you're in the States, you're welcome to come hang out. Your dad will be calling you, just it's all what was let's bygones be bygones, let's everything, and I'm like, yeah, wow, no.
It didn't last long. I remember the review. It
Yeah.
really didn't last long.
No, so I go, so the next visit home, my dad wants to meet with me. We talk to him. He's like, I just feel so badly the way everything went. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, but your Christianity, your version of it is a mockery of Christianity in the way I have come to understand it. He was shocked at that. And I kind of regretted saying it because I actually believe that he believed he was right, but it was probably good for him to hear.
The truth hurts sometimes.
Yeah.
Then my ex-wife wanted to meet with me. So she met with me and apologized. And it was all like apologies all around. My dad's like, come by anytime. You're always welcome in our house. And within about a year, I go back for my next visit, and it was all changed.
Yeah.
I had shown no interest in coming back. So that was all over. My mom had actually written a letter after this friendly visit saying, don't be upset with us. Your dad's doing what he thinks is right. Please don't. But she had apparently done this unsanctioned. So during my next visit, she had to profess in front of the priests to me that she had done what was wrong, and that she writing me a letter was against the Lord's will, and that she regretted it. And she wanted me to know that my communication with the brethren should be through the priests and not with her.
They just torture themselves. They torture themselves.
Yeah.
So then the drawbridge snapped up just as fast as it had dropped down.
Yeah.
And then in 2007, late 2007, I got an email actually from my brother-in-law saying that my father was dying. He had a kind of a chronic disease, kind of a cerebral arterial disease that manifested very much like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And they said, he doesn't have long. So I decided, I am kind of tired of England. And the more I thought about it, the more I weighed on it. I'm like, I should go back to the brethren. I should definitely go back. I've had my stint outside. Dad's dying. This is a message. They reached out to me. I've got to go back. So I quit my job. I moved home. Well, I moved back to the States. Actually took a consulting job in Virginia and was working on that. Reached out to the brethren. My brother-in-law was overjoyed. He's like, oh, hallelujah. The prodigal son returns. And so he's like, reach out to the brethren in Detroit. That's who you need to talk to. Because he was local in Columbus. So I reached out to the brethren in Detroit, nothing. Zippo, nada, zilch. I waited 2 weeks, but I'm just going to go. I'm just going to go to Detroit. I packed up all my stuff, drove to Detroit, and I went to a diner to have breakfast. I'm kind of mulling over next steps because I was absolutely convinced this is where I should be. And I see one of my cousins. I walk out of the diner and she was walking by on the street. It's like a shopping area. And she was walking by with one of their brother and girlfriends. And they apparently immediately called the priests, let them know I was in town. I get a call immediately within like an hour. And they're like, "You're here." And I'm like, "Yes, I wrote you guys weeks ago," but nobody even responded. Like nobody even said, "Hey, stand by, hey, come back." Nothing, like nothing. So then they kicked into high gear. They said, "Okay, no problem." So somebody owned a house that was not occupied. So they put some furniture in it for me. They said, "Come, we'll get you a job. We'll get you set up." Brother and sisters made me food. But while they were doing all this, they actually asked me to go stay at Dr. Truan's house. And I'm just thinking to myself, wait a minute, like I've been withdrawn from for years. The cardinal sin growing up would have been having an out in their house. I literally was living with the Truans. I was staying in their spare bedroom. They're making me meals. We're hanging out. We're doing stuff. And then when they went to meeting, they said, "Okay, we're just going to go to the reading. We'll be back in an hour and a half." And I was just my head was starting to explode. And I'm like this is bizarre. So then they were going to set me up in one of these. By this point, the Brethren businesses had all been sort of amalgamating and into these large enterprises. And so the others took me to two different businesses and were like, "You can work here, you can work here, and we'll set you up, and here's information, and you can start studying." And then I got moved into this house to be in on my own, and sisters filled the fridge with food, and then just like that, boom, everything stopped. Just like a wall dropped. They said, "Well, we think you should get a job, and we think you should find an apartment, and we'll go from there." So I'm like, "Well, this is bullshit. Like, what's going on here?" So I heard afterwards that they had apparently talked to Mr. Hales, and Mr. Hales had vetoed me coming back. And I don't know what I ever did to Bruce Hales, why that would be the case. But I do know there were rumors of me being gay. Maybe that was it. I had posted some stuff online on Dick Wyman's website about kind of anti-John Hales. Maybe there was some long memory. I think I referred to the depth of evil and darkness surrounding the Hales.
Well, I think we all know by now that Bruce Hales has a bit of a weird thing for his daddy. And so that's probably it right there, right? It's because if you say one thing against John Hales, it's like, "That's my daddy," right? He freaks out.
So then they rented me an apartment. They furnished it. And I'm like, I don't know where I'm going to get a job. I said, I only know the hotel business. Like, that's all I know. And you've told me that the hotel business is deeply evil. And they're like, "Fine, get a job in a hotel." That's completely cool. That's just fine. And by this point, I was bumped down the hierarchy of priests to just like two quite old elderly brothers that were just placeholders. And so I concluded, like, this is all bullshit. I would have never lasted anyway. So I lived in their apartment for a while, and then I got a place in the city and a job, and kind of resumed life as normal.
I think I can shed a bit of light on that sudden change of heart, where Bruce Hales intervenes and doesn't want you back, because I'm thinking probably it was around the same time there was a brother, ex-brother, name of Feller, Feller was the surname, and he had gone out in the UK probably in the 70s, and his sister was local with me. I knew his sister. This is an older guy, and he moved for some reason while he was out. He moved actually to Knoxville, Tennessee, near where Carmen is. And then he decided, late in his life, he wanted to go back to the Brethren, and they kept him waiting for I think, 2 or 3 years. In spite of being an older man with no connections, he had his own house. He was very fervent to get back. And we were told, I mean, I was in the Brethren at the time, and we were told that Bruce Hales is very reluctant to let people back in the Brethren if they've been out for a while. And the reason was that some persons who had come in from outside or who had gone back had caused a lot of trouble. And I think Bruce Hales' worry was that someone coming in after a long period would never fit in, and then they would kind of contact the media. I think there was a reference to a guy called, what was his name? Some weird name, Holiday or some such name. Some guy who had come in from outside and stayed in the Brethren a few years and then went off again and then contacted reporters. And so Bruce was actually just blocking, maybe if you'd only been out for a short time, but if you'd actually kind of had your own life in the world, he was just blocking those people from coming back.
Well, I can attest to that as well, because they blocked me. So I was confined in 2008. I joined the military in 2010. I found out that, we weren't sending troops armored, which I was at the time, to Afghanistan anymore. And I literally put in my voluntary release and got out of the military. And in my head, I was like, I'm going to move to the States because my parents just moved there. I'm going to go back into the Brethren for a bit, get my green card, join the American Marines. So I did this, and I told the Brethren that I was thinking about coming back. And my dad and Randy Cowie flew out to the military base in Gagetown, New Brunswick, came and visited me. Now, in reality, I had no intentions of staying back in the Brethren, but they put me up at a house that my grandparents owned, but weren't occupied because they'd also moved to Washington, D.C. from Montreal. And I was getting regular priestly visits from Randy and Derek Cowie. My father had set me up with a job because I was now out of the military, and I was doing construction work. And now I was still going to the bars and I was doing everything I wanted to do. But according to them, I was actually playing by the rules. I wasn't doing anything bad. And I was having priestly visits quite often. And all of a sudden the work dried up. So I had no work. I don't speak French in Quebec, so very hard for me to get a job. And, I had nothing. And to get into the States, I had to get to the States first to get the green card. And I called my dad, and my dad says, yeah, we'll take care of you. Don't worry. We'll get you an apartment. And I was like, okay. And I need food, work. I have nothing. He's like, yes, we'll take care of you. Don't worry about it. 45 minutes later, I had a priestly visit with Randy and Derek Cowie, and they said, well, Lane, we don't think your dad can help you out anymore. And I was like, what are you talking about? I just talked to him 45 minutes ago. And they're like, yeah, he just, we don't think he can help you out anymore. And just like that, I called my dad back after they left, and he said, I can't speak to you anymore. And that was it. Never talked to my dad for 8 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it's the family's decision.
Yeah, exactly. Right. 45 minutes, somewhere in that 45 minutes. And then the two priests were like, this is it. You're done. Just cut me off like that. Now, I also think they were probably spying on me somehow, maybe saw that I was going to bars and meeting girls and stuff, but I was pretty sneaky too. So I don't know. But yeah, what a blessing in disguise, right? What a blessing in disguise that they didn't let you back in, Bradley.
Thank goodness. Right? Thank goodness.
Yeah. And I just want the listeners to realize, listening to his story, it takes a long time to get over this. Because this is not a cult that people join partway through their life, because you're born into it. The indoctrination and the brainwashing starts as a child. It is hard to get over. It takes sometimes people multiple attempts at leaving, as you can hear, to get away from it. But it is so worth it to be out. It's so worth it.
And I think there's two different levels, right? So I actually was speaking, I have a few dads, people in your situation, Bradley, inside that I talk to regularly. And I was talking to one the other day, and it's such I think the listeners and viewers need to understand what it takes from a father to be able to break through those layers and layers and layers and layers of indoctrination, I think you need to give yourself a little bit of credit for getting up and needing that 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, you at least left her a letter, right? Like, I think looking back on that, man, you deserve that 110% to be able to recognize, I need this space. I've got to find some clarity. Because a father so indoctrinated, I mean, the females are in a different way. They're just submissive, right? But for you to be able to keep batting up against that and breaking through and breaking through and breaking through. Wow. When you said that you didn't really have a story, I'm sitting here listening to this and I'm mind blown. I don't even know how to respond because we'll go into a Cheryl rant. It'll be an hour long and we'll lose all the listeners.
No, we love Cheryl rants.
Because I'm really fired up inside.
Story.
Yeah.
I do want to, if you're willing, I want to shift to a whole other side of this story of your generations, of your generation, of your family and what they were involved in. Can you tell the viewers who your grandfather was?
Yeah, so my grandfather was my dad's father was Stanley McCallum. Stanley and Edna McCallum. He had immigrated he had been in the Open Brethren in Scotland, had worked on the fishing boats there, and then after the First World War, the fishing industry collapsed in Scotland. So he and his brother emigrated from Scotland to the US, and he ended up in Detroit, where he went to work for Ford Motor Company and then became very active in the Brethren and kind of rose through the ranks. By the time JT died in 1953, my grandfather, who was commonly referred to as S. McC, Stanley was pretty high up there in the tiers of Brethren. He came into a big spate of conflict with JT Jr., Mr. Taylor Jr. in 1958 to 60. There was a whole round of conflict with them then, which a lot of people don't realize, but almost resulted at that time in my grandfather being withdrawn from. And then my grandfather submitted to JT Jr. And then in 1970 was over in Aberdeen. You know, he bought into the Brethren. It's a little hard for me to feel too sympathetic towards my grandfather because he was a big part of the regime. You know, I mean, the regime's been rotten since its inception. I mean, it is just theologically completely off base. It is destructive in its character, and in its DNA is just a perverse understanding of Christianity. And embracing that and becoming a leader in it, I think is you know, irresponsible for that. So he worked through the 60s. He kept his head down during the system days in the mid 60s. He avoided any fallout from that. But then in 70, you know, he was in Aberdeen when JT Jr. was on his rampage through Scotland and Northern England. And S. McC was the one who went into the bedroom with Mr. Gardner and found JT Jr. naked in his bed. Well, he had
so just to give the picture, this is your grandfather finding the leader of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church in bed with a naked woman. It's not his wife.
Yes. And all Mr. Taylor had on was a pajama top. And weirdly, JT Jr. was my ex-wife's grandfather. So we had this deeply intertwined family shit. And, you know, and half of both of their kids went with, you know, half the Taylors stayed with Mr. Taylor, half of them left, half the McCallums left, and half of them stayed. You know, there was this complete rupturing of the two families. Anyway, but he went in there. And one of the things that's really interesting, so clearly JT Jr. is in bed with Mrs. Kerr. She's naked. He has a pajama top on, and that's it. And my grandfather, reportedly, and I actually believe it because there are some contemporaneous letters that support it, said to him, Jim, what would Renee say? Which was Mr. Taylor's wife. What would Renee say? And Mr. Taylor said to my grandfather, I suppose you're going to go tell her.
Wow. So that's someone
that
admitting
to me
that.
sums it up, that it was true.
Yep.
Because that exchange was a genuine, I believe, a genuine heartfelt exchange between two men who'd known each other most of their adult lives, who were caught in something really bad. I mean, S. McC wasn't doing it, but I just think it was a terribly unsavory situation. But that exchange has all the ring of authenticity to it to me. That's
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the brethren's come back to this, okay? Like in my generation, my parents, was that he orchestrated Taylor, was it right? And
Taylor claims it was all this choreographed event
it
to
was
draw out the opposition of my grandfather and his friends, which is so ludicrous. It's so ludicrous. What S. McC had stayed with him for 10 years. But I mean, JT Jr. was being a completely lewd, disgusting.
He was
person.
cheating on his wife. He was
But I
cheating
mean,
on
he
his
was
wife.
also in the meetings, the printed meetings. Read the meetings at Preston, which are just before Aberdeen. They're disgusting. They're ridiculous. I mean, how that's even passed off as remotely religious or spiritual. Anyway,
it's a man that's caught red-handed using a most ridiculous excuse because he's a categorical liar.
and drunk. And so they called. So my grandfather said, Jim, you need to stay here, and we're going to find James, because James III was there as well, somewhere in Scotland. He was not in Aberdeen. So my grandfather went and called James, and James, I don't know, he Scotland's not very big, so he came hustling over, and in the meantime, Mr. Gardner, whose house it was, kicked the Kerrs out, told Mr. and Mrs. Kerr they had to leave the house. And so I think they just went out and sat in the yard in the night and waited. So James III turns up at some point during the night. And this is that period where JT Jr. in his letters refers to that he was falsely imprisoned or wrongly imprisoned or something. And they were just keeping, they were like, you're sick. You're clearly unwell. This is like so egregious. A doctor showed up, some Brethren doctor, and was like, yeah, he's sick. He gets on a plane. This is Saturday night. He gets on a plane and leaves before the supper, like the first plane out of Scotland. So S. McC and Mr. Gardner and the others go on with the meetings. They have the supper. They have the final meeting, the reading and preachings of the day, and then S. McC gets on a flight home. By the time he lands in Detroit, JT Jr. had been home, maybe by 24 hours ahead of him, and had already gotten a hold of my dad and some others in Detroit. And Detroit had already withdrawn from S. McC without even talking to him.
Wow.
JT Jr. had said that they had charged him with corruption, and it was all false, and it was a thrust against God's throne and all this stuff.
A thrust against God's throne?
So there's this
the language they used?
The enemy's hand is on the throne of Jah.
They should be writers for Disney.
Yes.
And they should all be writers for Disney.
They referred to that as. So they withdrew from him. But to their credit, on Tuesday night, so then my grandfather arrives home and is like, okay, that's bullshit. Like, you guys need to know actually what happened. This is the deal. This is what he said to me about Renee. Like, no, this is. So on Tuesday night, so that was Saturday night, then Sunday night, JT Jr. gets home. S. McC gets home Monday morning. He's withdrawn from already. I think it was an assembly meeting on Sunday night. Tuesday at the ministry meeting, the Detroit Brethren have an assembly meeting and reinstate my grandfather. Say, oh, we were wrong. We should never withdrew from him 24 hours ago or 48 hours ago. You're back in politics. He takes the meeting. And then some brethren, a handful of families are like, no, we're with Mr. Taylor. This is the enemy's hand is on the throne of Jah, and they get up and walk out. And so the entire meeting in Detroit becomes withdrawn from, and not with Mr. Taylor. So then during the course of that next week, there's all this phoning going back and forth between, like, my dad was calling James III, James III was calling my uncle. Everyone was calling everyone, trying to figure out what the hell to do next, who was right, who was wrong, whose dad was in the clear, whose dad was telling the truth. And at one point, my dad calls what he thought was calling JT Jr., and he actually dialed James III. Or he meant to call James III, and he accidentally calls JT Jr. So Mrs. Taylor Renee answers the phone, and she's like, "Oh, Jim's right here. Why don't you talk to him?" So my dad ends up on the phone with JT Jr. This was, I think, on Wednesday, or Wednesday or Thursday. And he's like, "Garth," that's my dad's name, "Garth, it's lies. They're accusing me of all sorts of things. They're accusing me of being drunk. They're accusing me of fondling the breasts of women. They're accusing me of all sorts of corruption. And you need to stay with the assembly and stay with the right position and not be diverted by the enemy's attack." And very interesting in this, my father told this 1,000 times growing up. JT Jr. never denied the shit. He had it all cloaked in phrases. "I'm being accused of this. I'm being accused of that. This is an enemy's attack. This is this and that and the other thing." So my father became convinced, okay, I've spoken, I got it right from the horse's mouth, and it sounds convincing. And I believe JT Jr. was very charismatic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so my dad went back and asked to be restored to the brethren. And eventually most of the brethren did. My aunt stayed with my grandparents. For a while, James III, his wife was withdrawn from, because she didn't buy it. There was some questions about whether Mrs. Taylor was going to stay, but she eventually did. But like Ben Taylor left over this nonsense. And anyway, so that's all of that.
I've learned so
This
much
was
in
a
this
constant.
podcast.
This was a constant refrain growing up, and my mother would be crying. I mean, I was in my teens every time this whole story came up, because I mean, thinking back on it, like in 1985, when I would have been 15, it was only 15 years ago for her at that time. So it was relatively fresh, and the whole breaking up of all the families and friends, the complete splitting apart and the embarrassment, everything. Around that time, around in the mid 80s, I found a suitcase, and it was more like a briefcase, a large briefcase, in the basement of our house. My dad had saved everything going back to the 50s, and every newspaper clipping, every letter he had been sent or come across, or he had copied a lot of my grandfather's correspondence. This thing was packed and shit. And so I read it for like 2 or 3 days. And I couldn't believe it, because there was all these press articles about the eating matter. There was all this stuff, all these letters around the system in the mid 60s. And there was all this shit about Aberdeen. And finally I said, "Hey, I found this suitcase. Like, can we talk about this stuff?"
Yeah.
And he was kind of horrified at first, but then he just kind of like, "Oh, whatever, So, but it was pretty clear to me by then that, so I was in my mid-teens, and I'm like, I don't buy the whole, this is all a big hoax. I mean, and the other thing that was happening in my mid-teens was it was really becoming, I really wanted to go to university, desperately wanted to go to university. And most of my parents' generation of the, brethren weren't supposed to have friends, but everyone had friend cliques. And like all of my parents' cliques were all university educated. And there was a difference. There was a difference in these people, and there was a difference in the people that were completely indoctrinated with the Brethrenism. There was all these older brethren that had become doctors and lawyers and engineers, and had worked for worldly companies, and worked for worldly, had belonged to associations and had done all this stuff. And then there was the other brethren, the younger ones like Rick and his generation, that didn't. There was a very big difference. There are conversations in the house, the way they discuss things, the way they address things. There was there was just not this refinement or understanding of just kind of openness. There was an openness about these older brethren that there wasn't there in these new ones.
And they were much more interesting, I'll bet.
Much more interesting.
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
took the Brethren thing seriously.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that really floored me when I was also in this teen period where I was trying to figure shit out was, you know, JHS had this kind of sorry, Carmen, I hope I don't offend you.
Oh no.
He had this kind of anti-education, anti-higher education thing, telling people to piss on their degrees.
Yeah.
And he, at one point, there was this, in this older group of brethren, a lot of them, you know, every locality had a group of them. You know, they took Bible study seriously, and they read the old ministries and stuff. But there was a whole group of them in Des Moines. And at one point, I don't know what they had come up against him about JHS, but he made this big thing in one of these meetings about Des Moines needed to burn the Greek dictionaries and stop all this stuff, get spiritual. And I was like, so Dad, are you going to burn your Greek dictionary?
You know who else does this stuff? ISIS and the Taliban. They hate history and they blow shit up. They want to burn all the books.
He kept all his library, you know, intact. So
good.
Yeah, and I think JHS was such a farmer-minded person. He would have been somewhat intimidated by the degrees and the intelligence. Yeah. I mean, it's a good way to shut down your competition.
I mean, book burning has a really bad history in the world at large. There's a few people who do it, and none of them are very nice.
And do you remember, I don't know, Richard or Carmen, do you remember when the whole thing about burning CHC's books?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And then a bunch of them had to confess that they burned his books.
Yeah.
Somebody said there was more moral value in an asterisk books than there was in a CAC ministry books. So we all pulled them off the shelf and burned them all.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, they're bringing them back.
Yeah, that would have been around 86. I remember it very vividly because there was just one brother in Cambridge, a brother who tended to take things very literally, who, literally had a bonfire of CAC. And then he was called up, well, we're going to have to shut you up, dear brother, because you burned CAC. But then, he had only just come back. He had to be out of, he had been shut up for a couple of weeks because he and his wife had got up to some hanky-panky before they were married. Shocking thought. And so they actually, and this was quite to the credit of the dear brethren in Cambridge, they thought the poor old boy had enough, so they actually let him off the book burning charge. But it vividly sticks in my mind. Yeah.
Well, that whole 7-day matter of withdrawing from people for stuff they did when they were teenagers.
Yeah.
Was also really weird, and that was another thing that happened in the 80s that really caused me to second guess things. Is the brethren were being withdrawn from for every ridiculous little bit of nonsense. They were withdrawn from for 7 days and then restored. It was cleansing the assembly. It was cleansing the leprosy, purifying the assembly. And then Rick Wilson admits to smoking, which was one of the cardinal sins, which half the people are getting withdrawn from for, and he gets forgiven.
Yep.
But he doesn't have to be withdrawn from.
Yeah.
Brethren just are like, oh, well, we think we should forgive our brother. You know,
That's so funny. Speaking of smoking, too, I just had an insider tell me that there's brethren that secretly smoke, like multiple. And I was like, whoa, like that's I'm really surprised by that, to tell you the truth.
But I think the whole thing, I mean, if you build a system, if you build a church or a theological movement or a religious organization, essentially predicated on the negative, which is we are separating from, it's predicated on the negative. It's
predicated on egotism too. We are better. We're special.
There's no stability because you can never, that's why the repeated splits, it's not focused on the message of Jesus. I mean, every Christian, if you are religious or if you are a Christian, every Christian practices some form of quote unquote separation from evil. I mean, that's the whole concept of Jesus's work and Jesus's ministry. But this physical and emotional and familial separation that destroys families and destroys communities is a complete perversion of that.
And it's only a measure that's used as control.
It is.
Yeah.
I think it may have at one time, like in J&D's day, but I mean, J&D was not he was a smart man. But he was not some highly educated person. He was essentially, he graduated from high school.
Yeah.
And
if you read some of those really old ministries like FER had no inclination that people would physically separate themselves from each other. That was not what was meant by it back in those times.
No, interestingly, like
sorry, come on, Brad.
Like J&D, I believe, built up a system around himself. I think FER was kind of different, but not a single one of FER's children stayed in fellowship. Not one of them.
I don't think even his wife was in fellowship.
No.
Yeah.
So I mean, that was a kind of this weird interregnum, and then there was JT who kind of solidified this sort of organization and sort of the priest king sort of model.
Yeah.
And then JT Jr. was his own sort of weird thing, and then JHS was a really interesting kind of swerve.
Yeah.
And just because of his he was also charismatic in his own way. To the outsider.
Yeah, maybe to the outsider.
He had these really kind of slightly deranged meetings. Like, I don't know if any of you remember the meeting about red in Toronto, where he screamed red until he was hoarse.
Yeah.
I was terrified as a child. He screamed into the mic, red, over and over and over and over again.
You just answered a question I've had since childhood about why my grandmother hated red.
Yeah.
It
was a big deal. He would get very obsessive. And if somebody pissed him off, he would just sit there in the meeting and take them down. Like he was so obsessed with it. He would yell at them. He would call them names. He would say, crazy stuff. And Grandma didn't agree with it. You could see her curling herself up into a little ball. I remember when he went after Art Admiral. She said, "No, Jim, no." And anybody around her knew she wasn't agreeing with him. So her submission was not A level, apparently.
Yeah.
I think the brethren are also predicated on fear too, right? Like they breed fear of hell and Satan, and this they will say to people like I remember when I was young and I talk about leaving, they would say things like, "Aren't you scared of going to hell, Lane? Aren't you scared?" Like they are terrified that leaving the church automatically means torture chamber forever. And that's a sad, sad way to live.
Yeah.
It's another method of control.
Mm. Yeah, they missed the whole mercy glories over judgment thing completely.
Yeah.
I was looking up because this, when you try and write things about the brethren, they have this language of their own, and they talk about shutting people up, which people who've never been in the brethren find that a very shocking term. So I looked up, why do the brethren use this term? And it's scriptural. There's one reference in the Bible to shut up, and this is actually the origin of the term, and it's also the origin of the 7-day thing, being shut up for 7 days. And this is the book of Leviticus, which was written 3,000 years ago, and it's actually a section which talks about when you have a plague in your house, and it's not talking about the people in the house, it's about the structure of the house. So this is like an ancient engineering document. And this is what it actually says. And when he looketh on the plague, and behold, the plague is in the walls of the house, greenish or reddish hollows, and their look is deeper than the surface of the wall, then the priest shall go out of the house to the entrance of the house, and shall shut up the house 7 days. Now, I don't believe anyone really knows what this originally referred to, whether it's some kind of dry rot. It very definitely and specifically is talking about the structure of the house. There's separate verses and chapters that talk about sickness in people.
I'm going to give it a stab and say you're right with sickness of people. This is most likely something that they're like, we don't want the spread of the sickness. And they didn't have science back then. So the best explanation was build the walls this way and that. They're not talking about someone having sin inside them as plague in the house. I love this, Richard. Sorry.
But what I'm meaning is that there's no connection whatever between this verse written 3,000 years ago about some now unknown structural issue and what the brethren do and what they use it for. I mean, this is Old Testament. I mean, all the reference to priests, the reason brethren call each other priests is all derived from the book of Leviticus, and really that whole system was finished in the New Testament time. That's replaced. That's the law. That's the Jewish law. And yet this is how they justify these weird practices, like shutting people up for 7 days just on the basis of this one verse.
It's a type of silencing, right? Just try and silence you too.
Well, I mean, the point is that when they say everything they do is justified by scripture, yes, they attach a scripture to everything they do, but there's no connection between the scripture and what they do.
Yeah, the context.
Yeah, exactly. The context.
It might be something to do with the 3,000 years ago. It might be. Just saying.
Go ahead, Bradley.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been I can't say anything bad personally, like about JHS or John Hales. They were very nice to me personally. They're very nice to my parents. But I witnessed stuff and sat through meetings where there was just egregious stuff said that makes no sense. So after I kind of got shook free of all this after the going back, I took a real long pause from anything brethren related. And I've never spoken publicly, honestly, about my experiences, but it's just, I think it's a deeply corrupt and evil system. I think it's a complete perversion of Christianity.
Do you think it's important that people talk about their experiences now and give some relief?
I think they should. I don't think people who don't want to should be
absolutely
denigrated. But I think that it is important. But this is not a recent thing. I mean, there are certain people who are really obsessed with obsessed with Bruce Hales or something. This has been going on for generations. I mean, this nonsense and this ridiculousness has been going on for literally generations.
And I think too, what you said about the college education and that, I think that when you look at that generation was very well taught in the Bible. They read the Bible and they knew scriptures in their context. And what we saw during Grandpa Simonton's time, and then times more recent, they don't study the Bible, and they're so focused on the ministry, they've lost all practical application of biblical principle.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so far off the rails.
I agree with that 100%. I think there's always been these loose stones in the foundation as far as the basis of the way the thing was set up.
Yeah.
But when I was young, I mean, there was a lot of older brethren who were serious about their faith, who lived kind of godly lives, didn't treat people badly. I mean, there were times when they were treated badly. But I think that beginning in JHS's time, there was this weird going off the rails of you don't study things, you just, and kind of this iconoclastic kind of trashing of anything serious in terms of study of the scriptures and the truth. But I think I think you're touched on something really interesting, Carmen, in that I think maybe he was intimidated by these people.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the whole farmer mentality, like farmers were working from sun up till sundown, and they didn't spend any time in the Bible. They didn't spend any time studying. When they got home, they ate if they could eat before they went to meeting, and then they went to meeting. And by the time meeting was over, they were exhausted. So they found people that did have that time. They found they were intimidated by them.
Yeah, and I think also that generation. I mean, like my dad talked about. There were, people, particularly in the cities, I mean, eating in restaurants that had bands and like going on these transatlantic crossings and going to dinner with the music playing and a lot of them had summer cottages, like your Grandpa Simonton would come up to my grandparents' cottage on Lake Manitoba
Yeah.
But I mean, my grandma would take the kids up there as soon as they got out of school and not come back till the fall.
Yeah.
No, they lived essentially semi-worldly lives, but I think to a hardworking farmer who had kind of a slight chip on his shoulder, inferiority complex,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff was probably really, really intimidating.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
I was talking to an insider this week, and he did a very good job explaining the classes inside the Brethren now. He said you've got these two main classes. There's the Plymouth Brethren. They're your everyday regular Christian, right? Like he says, it's like your parents, Cheryl. He's like, they're your everyday Christian. And he said, then there's the exclusive Brethren. And he said, it's the exclusive Brethren that run the show.
Interesting.
And I would say the other way of defining that is there's the employed and there's the employers. The business owners are all in one separate class. They run everything. They run the school, they run the meeting, they run the religious side, they run the money side. And then the employees are more or less their slaves, and they're just there to be preyed on. They don't have any influence, religious or financial.
And I'm not going to reveal the story that was given to me because I it's confidential, but the story that was laid on my lap brought me to tears. Absolutely brought me to tears. I like, Bruce, you should be freaking ashamed of yourself with how you let the poor stay poor. It just, man, makes me so sad. Like the money is not being distributed the way it's supposed to be. There are people struggling hugely financially in there.
But I mean, during JHS's time and Mr. Hale's JSH's time, they actually lived more or less sort of along the lines of their ministry. But I mean, J&D had servants. He's vaunted as this sort of great, pilgrim who gave up all his wealth. No, he lived in a 5-story townhouse in London with servants. FER was the secretary of the Naval College. He was in the upper tiers of the British establishment. JT and JT Jr. had houses on the beach. They had these giant homes in Brooklyn with servants and maids and cooks. And they live. This has always been the case. It's always been that way.
It's like this in every cult. It's like this in every cult.
Yeah.
Say that again, Bradley.
There's always been an aristocracy or a nobility in the Brethren.
Yeah.
That everybody else didn't quite measure up to, but there was a circle that mingled at the top.
Yeah.
I
think we even saw that in the interchange. Like Nitchie was the little farming town and Woodlands was another little farming town, and they all had a chip on their shoulder for the Winnipeggers. And it came out in the kids. Like the kids would have snowball fights, and it was everybody against the Winnipeggers. What goes on in the adults and the attitudes in the adults come out in the kids.
Yeah. And I mean, we're seeing that through the reports of One School Global, right? Like you're really seeing that being reported. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, Bradley, that eventually things will come crumbling down to be rebuilt? Or like, what do you think?
I don't, honestly. I think it's survived for 200 years. I think it's probably going to continue. And the way I've come into very little conflict or direct confrontation with my family about things, because my position on it is, if I'm asking to be accepted for the choices I make, my kids are all adults now. They've all made a choice to stay in and not have contact with me. My siblings, my parents are both dead, but they're making that choice. That's their prerogative. I'm not going to but I mean, there's stuff that people where things should be, people should be held to account is where there's been criminal activity, but whether in business, whether it's sexual molestation, there's all sorts of crap that goes on in there, as we know. I was shielded very much from most stuff growing up. I mean, as a teen, I started to see the business stuff, the corruptness of the tax evasion and stuff I thought was deeply corrupt. My dad handled the money in Detroit for the Brethren, and there was all that weird white envelope cash stuffing nonsense going on, and then there was stuff in his business, and it didn't ring true, to the claims of purity and stuff. But I don't think it will, honestly. I think it might, it could.
I have a dream
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is it's not about bringing it to its feet to get rid of it, right? Like it's not that. It's about bringing it to its feet for accountability and then rebuild it the way that it was meant to be.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe how the whole current regime with this bizarre, like, multi-million-dollar mansions and private jets and all that nonsense, and the serfs, the nobility and the serfs thing. I have a hard time seeing that going on endlessly, because it was never like that. I mean, like I said earlier, there was always, many of the leaders had very luxurious lives, traveled first class, did all this stuff, but it was never sort of in your face as egregious and it's sort of ridiculous as it is now. And I have trouble seeing how that continues. But then you take both of my brothers-in-law, they're both really extremely smart businessmen. They're extremely nice people. They've always been very nice to me. And I think they've bought into it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, to see, living in gigantic homes on golf courses just is mind-boggling to me. But I think there's a clever move that's been, or a series of moves over time, where there's these key people in different places around the world that have been sort of bought off by the regime by giving power and privilege. And they can kind of hold the serfs at bay. It's not dissimilar to Imperial Russia, prior to the.
Well, that didn't end well, did it?
It didn't. That is true, but it took 600 years.
Yeah.
But I think a likely outcome is a split between the, as you say, between the serfs and the aristocracy. I mean, the aristocracy doesn't have much reason to destroy or destabilize the system because they're benefiting from it. But there's a whole class of people that are financially and emotionally trapped in the system by family ties and employment. And I think it's going to get to a point where a very large number of those are going to see through it and want to get out. And then the question comes, can they extricate themselves from the system?
Yeah. And I think so many are already seeing through it, right? By the amount of people that I talked to and that we've all had contact with inside there's a lot of people that are really starting to see through the system. It's just a matter of how do they all stand up together and make some sort of a change, right? Or walk out. But they need the thing is they need a lot of people that I talk to, they need their businesses to leave with, right?
Well, they don't need to. Some of us left with nothing.
That's a really good point.
And I think
we sucked it up and did it.
And I do somewhat, I understand how difficult it is. And I understand the terror and the fear, but I do bristle somewhat when people say I can't go. Because I need my money.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up.
It's very interesting because I did exactly the same as you did. I left all my money. I wasn't going to take the house away from my ex-wife and my children. So I literally left with nothing. My net worth was around about $1 million US, include the house and everything. And when they came after me with the top lawyers they could. My wife actually divorced me. They got the top lawyers. The brethren always use divorce lawyers, and they wrote me this sort of major intimidating letter. And I said, look, you can relax, guys. I'm not actually asking for anything. And it was, and then, so they drew up a divorce. My wife actually gave me £25,000. She said she wanted me to have it, although I was prepared to walk away with nothing. So all that money went straight to a lawyer to help some legal matters. But yeah, so in practice, I left with nothing. I just had to find a job.
But I was talking.
You can do that. It takes a while, but it's possible.
I was talking to a recent leaver who was talking about that, and I was saying, I may never have the money like that my brothers have, and all that rich and business and everything, but everything I've got, I did for myself with zero help from them. My brothers have built a business on top of my dad's business. Sure, they made it bigger, but there's something about leaving clean slate, having nothing, and everything around you built for yourself. There's something amazing that no one can ever take that away from you.
Yeah, I've got an uncle who lives in Scotland who was kicked out of the Brethren when he was 17. He's treated incredibly cruelly. He was put in a caravan in the front yard because he didn't want to break bread. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just didn't want to break bread.
He just didn't do enough good.
Yeah, well, it wasn't even that. It was when JT Jr. brought in that everyone has to break bread in the household. And that was, up to then you'd had to ask to break bread.
Yeah.
And then JT says, well, no, you can't have anyone living under your roof that's not breaking bread. So everyone's either got to break bread or get out. And he didn't want to. They put him in a caravan in the front yard. And then the priests come along and say, no, that's too close for comfort. So they move the caravan to a recreation ground way out in the country and leave him there all winter to fend for himself. But he picked himself up by his bootlaces, took himself to university, got a very good engineering degree. He still didn't have any money. He had, I think he told me, $100 in his bank account, and he spent the whole of it on buying an engagement ring for his beloved.
Aww.
And so at that point, he literally had nothing. He then went on to an extremely successful career as an engineer on the Concorde supersonic aircraft, on military submarines, set up his own marine engineering business, which he sold for, I think, about, I'm guessing, £20 million or so, quite a few years back. And he now lives in a beautiful old stone manor house in Scotland, and he collects classic cars. He's got a Rolls Royce with his initials as the number plate. He's got classic Jaguars, and he's extremely well off. Thank you very much. And he left the Brethren and started with nothing. So
It's
that
possible.
confirms what you say.
Yeah, don't
You can
make sure you're not selling your soul to the devil for a reason that can be let go of. Yeah.
And I can't guarantee this, of course, but I can almost guarantee you're not going to go to hell. Not for leaving the Brethren. No, there's no torture chamber for people that leave the exclusive Brethren. You may be coming from hell, but that's not where you're going to.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the funny part about it. Coming from hell.
Yeah.
Speaking of all this stuff, I remembered something, Carmen. One of the last time I saw your grandfather actually was, we were in Nietzsche. Well, we were in St. Vincent doing something, visiting my grandparents, and we had gone over to Jim and Trissy's for the break. And I don't know, there wasn't a ton of brethren there. There was my folks, my grandparents, and maybe 10 other people. And JHS was at this point, I think, blind. Was he blind at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was very, very unwell. He was kind of propped up in a lazy boy.
Yeah.
And Trissy gave him some food and things during the break, but we all sat kind of silently in the living room around on those chairs. And then the weird thing that sticks in my mind was at the end, when it came time for us to go, we all stood up in single file, walked by his chair and kissed him.
Yeah.
It was very much like kind of like a papal audience or something. We literally all filed by, leaned over and thanked him for having us and kissed his face.
That's straight up from The Godfather. That's straight from The Godfather.
It's also not very hygienic, is it?
I used to think everybody sitting there in those chairs in kind of a semicircle, it was like birds on a highline wire. Nobody said a word.
Nobody said anything. Everyone just ate some food, and then we all got up and filed past the Godfather and kissed the ring.
Oh,
and I was usually serving the food, and if anybody had extra large feet, my nightmare was if you tripped over somebody's feet and the tray went everywhere.
Oh yeah.
I think you were there that day. We were there actually.
Yeah, we were there every Sunday, so probably.
Well, we should probably wrap this up. We probably could sit here for another couple hours, but yeah. Bradley, I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Me too.
I felt like I just sat in a class and had my mind blown and had to absorb and digest things that I'm just.
Thanks a lot for coming on.
Yes, thank you very much.
It was incredibly interesting, Bradley. Thank you so much.
Anytime you like Cam ready to do another one, just message us.
Okay. Sounds good.
So grateful for you to come on, and sending much love to everybody else that's out there. Please remember to subscribe, like, and comment down below, please. It helps us with getting this out to the masses.
Share,
Much
share,
love to you
share.
all. Yeah. Take care.
Yeah, and if you're inside, you can get out. Life is really, really good. Life is really good. Really good.
If Bradley can do it, you can do it. I
Take
can't.
care, everybody.
Yeah, take care.
To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me.